When my big sister asked me to be her maid of honor back when I was 18, I was like, yes, of course, I'll stand by your side. But then she told me that Zach, the creep who was obsessed with me, would be the best man. He was Dan's best friend, and seeing as Dan was marrying my sister, I was forced to put up with Zach being around all the time. He was a nightmare. And on top of all that, my sister's been trying to convince me that we'd make a cute couple. Yeah, right. Was she insane? Anyway, a week before the big day, my sister asked me if the four of us could meet up for dinner to discuss last minute wedding stuff. When I went to the restaurant, I found out that Zach was there alone. I was about to walk back out, but then he saw me and started shouting out my name with excitement. Ah, great. I asked where my sister and Dan were, and he just laughed and said they'd set us up. And to top it off, Zach had already ordered food for me. When my order arrived, it was a small salad plate. I asked what was going on, and he said, "Well, I just assumed you'd want to look your best before the wedding." I had no words. Instead, I picked up a glass of water and threw it right in his face. "I hate you!" I screamed at him as I stormed out. I wanted to call my sister and tell her I wasn't going to dance with Zach at the wedding, but I couldn't ruin her special day. So I grinned and bared it. The wedding was actually nice, up until the moment when Zach and I had to dance together. He whispered in my ear that I looked really hot. Then, without even thinking, I crunched down on his big toe with my heel. It was a garden wedding, so he'd taken his shoes off. He leaped back and screamed in pain, and it was bad. His toe was basically hanging off. Definitely broken, I thought. The worst part, my sister watched it happen, and in front of everyone, she came up to me and started shouting that I had to ruin everything. It was a disaster. I made a quick getaway, and I could feel everyone looking at me. Eventually, my sister forgave me, but I didn't see Zach again until a year later at my sister's baby's christening. When he saw me, he hobbled over and pretended his toe was still broken. My sister saw us talking and came running over looking panicky. I reassured her that it was all water under the bridge now, and then she said, "Good, because you two are going to be Amanda's godparents." What? I thought. No way! But then, what did it matter? It was just a formality. It's not as if godparents actually had to do anything, right? Believe it or not, Zach gave me his cell number that day and made a corny joke about being my god husband and said, "See you later, god wife." Cringe. A few months later, though, he did give me a call. I almost didn't answer the phone because I wasn't in the mood to chat with him. When I answered, I decided to make a joke about his toe, but I regretted it so much. He was crying. All I heard was, "There's been an accident. It's your sister. Come quick." Then, suddenly, the room was spinning, and I started screaming. And the next moment, Zach was outside and driving me to the hospital. But it was too late. She'd died in a tragic car accident. She'd been on a work trip and was rushing back home when it happened. Zach basically carried me through the hospital. And when I saw Dan and Amanda in her baby stroller, I burst into tears. Dan and I just stood there holding each other, and it was one of the worst nights of my life. My parents arrived the next day, and Mom and Dad were devastated. They hadn't even made it back for Amanda's christening, as they'd been living abroad teaching for a bit. Their faces were full of guilt and regret, and I couldn't bear it. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Mom and Dad eventually went back to their jobs, and Zach and I spent more and more time looking after Dan and Amanda. One night, we were all at Dan's place, and Zach kept flirting with me. Then, as Dan put Amanda to bed, Zach came and sat next to me, and I could feel him staring at me. Then, suddenly, he put his hands on my face and tried to kiss me. At that exact moment, Dan came running in and saw. He kicked Zach out of the house. Dan came and hugged me and told me that Zach was a jerk, but my sister hoped I'd end up with him for some reason. Then there was a moment of silence, and he started crying, which of course set me off. Soon we were both sitting there, sobbing and hugging, and maybe because of how sad and lonely we both felt, something happened between us. Dan kissed me. At first, I was shocked, but soon I was kissing him back. And then things just started to escalate, and I couldn't stop it. Ironically, that's how I started taking on the role of Amanda's godmother. I started staying at Dan's place often. Dan enrolled his daughter in kindergarten, and I would pick her up every day. She'd just started talking, and one day she called me Mommy in front of the teacher. Before I could even correct her, the teacher said that I seemed like a wonderful mother. Then she commented on how much we looked alike. I blushed and ran out of there. This went on for a while. Dan would take her to school, I'd pick her up, and we'd usually eat together, and then I'd go home and study. Around the time of my graduation, Amanda was going into first grade. She turned to Dan and said, "Daddy, why doesn't Mommy live here too?" It was the first time she'd asked that, and Dan went beetroot red and looked at me. I decided it was time to tell her what had happened, but instead she came up to me, took my hand, and said, "Come on, Mommy. Dad has a big bed. You can sleep here." She really thought I was her mom. We joked about it that night after Dan put her to bed, and then we opened a bottle of wine to celebrate my graduation. Then he turned to me and said, "You know, you can stay here. We can be a real thing." This wasn't right. This was my dead sister's husband. But I liked him too. Oh my gosh. I liked him so much. And that's how I moved in with Dan. It felt wrong, but wouldn't my dead sister want us to be happy? Until then, I thought my sister's husband and I were almost the perfect couple. But then I noticed that Dan drank a lot. We'd always open a bottle of wine with dinner, but then I'd go to bed, and in the morning I'd find at least another 3 empty bottles. I was still in touch with Zach, so I tried to speak to him about Dan and the drinking, asking if he'd always been like that. And Zach said I needed to be careful, that Dan had had many issues, and that he wasn't dealing with the grief properly. He even said that it would be best if I don't hang around him too much. Until one morning, I had an important job interview, and Dan was supposed to drive Amanda to school. I ended up skipping the interview because he was clearly still drunk. I was so angry with him, and we got into a big fight. He couldn't control his anger and started throwing glass plates at me. After that, it got worse. He started calling me by my sister's name all the time, which made me feel like crying each time. He also revealed to me that he was only with me because I reminded him of his wife, who he misses, but that I was doing a horrible job in being like her. I was so shocked, but I didn't want to believe what he was saying. I told him I could help him, that I knew he had a drinking problem, but one day he got angry over something silly and he kicked me out of the house. I had nowhere to go, so I headed to Zach's place. I turned up on his doorstep, sobbing, and said, "You were right. Why are you always right?" He let me in, and I told him everything. I was so ashamed for getting into a relationship with my dead sister's husband. I thought he would judge me, but he didn't. Zach seemed to be very understanding and said it was normal for me to make wrong choices after going through something traumatic. But then Zach revealed to me something that made me want to go back and kill that jerk. The night my sister died, she'd been rushing home because Dan had been drunk, and she was worried he'd neglect to look after Amanda properly. She cursed herself for leaving him alone with such a small baby. I felt sick. Her accident could have been prevented. I wanted to blame Dan for this, but Zach told me that until he acknowledges he had an addiction, there wasn't much to be done. But there was something. We were godparents, which meant we could try and get custody of Amanda. I didn't trust Dan at all. Amanda was in danger. We called social services, and then we got a lawyer involved. And within 2 months, we won custody of her. The worst part was explaining to her that I'm actually her auntie and not her mom. Luckily, she was still quite young, and it wasn't so bad. I rented us a small apartment so she could live with me. Then on weekends, she stayed at Zach's place. With time, the 3 of us were family. Zach treated me and Amanda in such an amazing way that I kind of felt guilty about treating him badly in the past. After a while, Zach suggested we all move in together, but I knew he liked me, and I wasn't sure that I should be getting romantically involved with him, so I said no. He tried to act cool about it, but I could see how upset he was. Until one Sunday, Zach dropped Amanda off, and she told me that they'd gone to the aquarium that day with Zach and a pretty lady. My heart almost stopped. "Is that his girlfriend?" I asked her. And she said, "I don't know." Why did this bother me? I tried to shove it off my mind, but I couldn't. My gosh, he was the one I'd spoken to about my problems with Dan, the one I'd run to when everything crumbled, and yet part of me always thought I liked him too, but now he had a girlfriend. It was so embarrassing as I started crying in front of Amanda. At that moment, the doorbell went. Amanda ran to answer it, and to my complete shock, it was Zach. Amanda had left her jacket at his house, and he figured she'd need it for school. He asked if I was okay, and then, before I could reply, Amanda said, "I told Auntie Caitlin about the pretty lady, and she started crying." I was mortified. Zach walked towards me, and I thought he was about to make a joke, but instead he said, "You do know I've liked you ever since I first met you. I've been chasing you since you were 18, Caitlin, but I didn't think you were interested. Listen, she's just a girl I'm dating. It's you I'm actually in love with." I tried to look like I didn't care, but I couldn't hide my smile. I liked him too. I guess what I'm trying to say to everyone watching my story, you might think you know someone well, but then you're shocked to discover they're completely different. Going through tough times together is the only thing that will reveal their true colors.